Hey, welcome to Tape, powered by Ram Motor Trends, back-to-back winner of Truck of the Year. I'm Ryan Dixon. I'm a writer with Sportsnet. Joining me on the other line, as always, an NHL editor who saw actual NHL hockey yesterday, Rory Boylan.
We're back, baby. Man, that was like a breath of fresh air. Like coming up out of a deep dive and taking a nice breathe in. It felt normal. It looked strange, but there was some normalcy there. It felt really good to have hockey back on, even though it was exhibition. It wasn't, playoff intensity or anything like that. A little taste of it in the Battle of Alberta, but it was just nice to have it back, wasn't it?
Yeah, though I have to say, it looked and sounded a little less weird than I thought it was going to.
Agreed. Yep.
And one of the early epiphanies I had was playoff hockey isn't about perfection, or compelling hockey isn't about perfection. It's about urgency. And you could already see a little bit of it because I think, number one, everyone's excited to be back. And number two, teams know this is the one game they're going to get as a tune-up. But it just gave me a little bit of a taste of the fact that as long as teams are going like hell, it's probably going to seem and feel like playoff hockey.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, these guys have been off the ice for longer than an off season. And some guys you saw play in that first game, Jake Gensel comes to mind, off Ilya Mikheyev off longer than that because
Half a year, more than half a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
8
So
months, basically.
it's important for all these guys to kind of get their feet back into them and find some level of intensity. But for those players, even more so, because it's been extra long for them. And lo and behold, both of them, Gensel and Mikheyev, figured in very early and looked pretty strong. Could be big X factors for those teams in their qualifying round play-in series.
So, Rory, we previewed the Western Conference preliminary series, Stanley Cup qualifiers. I guess this whole the best of 5 series and the round robin are kind of coming under the umbrella of Stanley Cup qualifiers. I've still been calling this the preliminary round, these best of 5 series. So we looked at the 4 in the Western Conference last week. Today, we're going to break down the Eastern Conference. We're going to start with the 5 seed and 12 matchup, then the 6-11, and then the back half we'll do 7-10 and 8-9. So those matchups are, of course, Montreal-Pittsburgh in the 5-12, Carolina Rangers in the 6-11, your Florida Panthers and the New York Islanders in the 7-10, and the Toronto Maple Leafs and Columbus Blue Jackets. That's the 8-9 matchup. So let's start with Montreal and Pittsburgh. Both those teams played on Tuesday. I think every single person in our Sportsnet predictions piece picked the Penguins to win this series. I mean, even with the caveat that anything can happen, a healthy Pittsburgh Penguins team, a team that, should have been up in that top 4 and should be playing in the round robin, except it skidded a little bit toward the end of the season before the hiatus. But here they are. They've got to win this best of 5 series. They probably should do it. But I think there's some belief the Canadiens can give them a good fight.
But there wasn't a lot of inspiration that you could draw from that exhibition game. And, you're not going to look into those and say, oh, well, they're doomed because they had this one bad preseason game. But Montreal I didn't think looked ready. I thought it was really disturbing that they allowed 2 shorthanded goals against. I mean, the power play has been a real sore spot for them most of the season. And from January 1st into the pause, they were a league worst 10%. They're not going to find it easy to get goals against the Pittsburgh Penguins at 5-on-5. So you've got to be able to manufacture on that power play. And if it's going to be that much of a liability, I mean, this series is over before it begins. That there's no advantage for Montreal anywhere except maybe in net. And to that end, the one plus is the thing they needed to go right for them against Toronto was Carey Price looked pretty good. I mean, they lost and allowed 4 goals, but I don't really think you're putting any of that on him. I thought he looked fine. I thought, he didn't look like he was too rusty or anything like that. There's a lot of things that need to go just right, I think, for Montreal to not only win but compete in this series against Pittsburgh. But it's not going to matter if Carey Price isn't on top of his game. He's going to have to basically steal a couple of games, if not all three of them, if they're going to pull off an upset. I just think Montreal is, it's not that they're not deep. They're just not deep with quality enough to match up against what they're going to see. Like what your best line, I think, is the line that's centered by Philip Deneau. And I kind of think he should have been a Selke finalist this year, which means that type of player is going to see a lot of Evgeny Malkin and Sidney Crosby, and that's going to neutralize his offense and his wingers. And then, so if he's tied up with those guys, do they have a line that is ready to step up and produce at 5-on-5 or in any situation, really? And I just don't see what part of that lineup outside of the net minding that you could point to and say, yeah, maybe they would have an advantage here. I just don't see a path for Montreal unless Carey Price, does a Yaroslav Halak from many, many years ago against the Washington Capitals and just is outstanding for 3 games.
Well, Halak did it to the Penguins as well that year.
That's true, right?
There is some precedent.
Right? Yeah.
So speaking of goalies, the Penguins did split Murray and Jari in their exhibition loss to the Flyers. You have to believe Mike Sullivan will defer to the experienced guy, Matt Murray, when push comes to shove. Like, is that your game one guy?
I think so. And I think it's, you kind of read between the lines. You see what the coach and the GM have been saying about the goalies leading up to this. And in a piece with The Athletic last week, Jim Rutherford said, it's the coach's decision who starts, but if it was up to me, I think Murray would be the guy. And he went on to talk about a practice last week where he thought Murray was back to his form from 2 and 3 years ago. He looked solid. He was, playing the fundamentals all right, hitting all the right notes. And then he comes in and he was the guy they gave the start to, whether or not they split them. I mean, Murray was the guy in for puck drop. And I think that is maybe the coach tipping his hand a little bit. And, the only way that I would come out of that game and say maybe there's a controversy here or maybe it's Jari who's going to get that game one start is if Murray played poorly. And he didn't play his way out of a start. He allowed a couple of goals. Again, I think they were defensive lapses in front of him. One of them was just a horrible Evgeny Malkin pass to no one across the crease, which Kevin Hayes intercepted and deked out Murray. I mean, those were defensive lapses. They weren't on Murray. So he didn't play his way out of that start because of what's been said and because of how they deployed those guys in that exhibition game. I would expect Murray to be the game one starter. The question, though, is how long is that leash? Like, does he get the game one start no matter what? And then if you lose, you reassess? Or if he has a bad first period where he lets in 2 or 3 goals, do you immediately go to Jari? Like, how much does it take before you go to that backup? Because, again, we talked about this last week. These aren't best of 7 series. They're best of 5. So you got a lot less runway to work with.
And the last best of 7 Pittsburgh played, it's almost easy to forget. They were swept by the New York Islanders. So, I mean, I guess they carry a little bit of baggage from their immediate past into this. When you look at the Penguins, I mean, we're both picking them to beat Montreal. When you look at their long-term prospects, is there something you worry about in terms of one area of the team you think, I don't know if critically flawed is too strong a term, but is there an area you look at and think this might prevent them from going as far as they want to go? Or do you think this team has as good a chance as any to get through to the final?
I really think they have as good a chance as any team. The question is, and it goes with any team, but Pittsburgh has dealt with a lot of injuries this year. And if you have to go through any of that right now, my one question about them is, do they have the required depth that would be able to come in and play the key roles, not to beat Montreal, but to beat the better teams that they're going to have to face down the line. Certainly Letang has had issues. I mean, John Marino has stepped up and been a really good defender for them, so he could take on more minutes. But anytime Letang goes down, that puts a lot of pressure there. Of course, Malkin, Crosby, those guys. Gensel is back. Anybody like that goes down is going to put a lot of pressure on depth that I'm not really sure that they have. So that's where the concern would go. But I think the Penguins are just this team that you can't really see where they finished in the regular season, 5th this year in the East, and say, yeah, maybe they're kind of on that fringe of being a real contender because they're so experienced. with such great leaders. Like they know when to turn it on and kind of when to take their foot off the gas a little bit. Like they're probably not going to run away with a President's Trophy. They don't need to go all out for 82 games, and they understand that their leaders understand really what it takes to get through 4 and now 5 rounds of playoff hockey. So I look at the Pittsburgh Penguins and I see like a middle of the pack power play in the regular season that wouldn't at all surprise me if they light the league on fire in the playoffs. You know, Malkin at times looked okay yesterday, but for the most part, that giveaway being the biggest whiff of the game, I thought he looked a little sluggish, but I don't think that's anything to read into. I think that's an exhibition game, and I would fully expect Malkin to turn it on once the puck drops on game one. So, I think they're as well suited as anybody else, as long as one of those goalies is able to take it and run with it. I would pick them over a lot of teams. When we had to pick our Stanley Cup champion for the site, they were one of the teams that I was weighing and thinking long and hard about, because there's a lot of time that they've had to rest and prepare. And I think that's going to benefit the veteran teams like the Penguins.
Don't give away your pick yet. We'll be saving that for a future podcast. Okay, so safe to say you've got Penguins in 3 or 4 for this series.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with 4. I think Price can steal at least one game. I think he's got that in him. So I don't know about the sweep, but I'll go with 4. It's gonna be a quick series.
All right, I think I had 4 as well. Let's turn our attention to the Hurricanes and the Rangers. The Rangers, of course, having a surprisingly good year and really jumping up and pushing for a playoff spot toward the end of the season. And Carolina, speaking of things that is kind of easy to forget, this was a Final Four team last year where it made the East Final and lost in 4 straight to the Bruins. Also, it seems like a lifetime ago, but they really won the trade deadline. Vincent Trocheck, Brady Shea, Sammy Vatanen, that's going to help make up for, on the blue line, the fact that there are some question marks there. Brett Pesce out. Dougie Hamilton doesn't look like he's going to play as we record this on Wednesday in the preseason game. I think they're hoping that he's going to be ready to go for the series itself, but I think by his own admission, not really at 100% after breaking his leg in early February. He was having an amazing year. But man, I look at the top 3 lines for Carolina now, with Aho centering 1, Trocheck, and then Jordan Staal on a 3rd line. And man, that top 9 is looking really tough.
Yeah, I mean, for years, the thing with Carolina, right, was that they were a good team by analytics, by Corsi and shot differential. They were always at or near the top of the league, but they couldn't score goals. It didn't translate into getting on the score sheet. And that was always a problem for them. But now, some of these young guys, Aho, I mean, Andrei Svechnikov had a huge year for them this year too. Like, these guys are now starting to hit that next gear where they are the offensive leaders that the Hurricanes didn't have before. And so that's something this team has never had in its arsenal that suddenly they do. And I think the biggest question is going to be their goaltending. You still feel really solid about that blue line, even if Hamilton misses some time. Like you said, they made some additions. Like there is a lot to choose from there. Their 7th and 8th defensemen are going to be pretty good. So if someone has to sit out, you're probably going to be okay. It's very similar to the Calgary Flames, I think, in that way. But now you have this goal scoring that you didn't have before, and that's going to be a huge difference maker as long as the goaltending is fine. Carolina is sneaky, sneaky good on the offensive side of the puck, and they're only going to get better there.
So what do you make of the Rangers? They are, a go-for-it team with an offense driven by Hart Trophy candidate Artemi Panarin and also Mika Zibanejad, the goals per game leader this year in the NHL. They're a little loose on the back end, but if Igor Shesterkin is what he appeared to be in 12 games, I mean, number one, it sure seems like this is his time. The reins are being passed, even though it's such a small sample size, but it's going to be him in the Rangers crease. They get to be a wild card if all of a sudden he's playing the way his predecessor, Henrik Lundqvist, did for so many years for this team.
Yeah, he's the ultimate X factor there. Like, what is he? And if he falters, they'll go right back to Henrik Lundqvist, I think. And, regardless of the season he had, I think you're going to feel pretty okay if Henrik Lundqvist is your plan B, even at this stage of his career. I've been chipping away at this article for Sportsnet.ca. I think I'm going to release on Friday about bold predictions for the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I've wanted to pick the Rangers as this year's Cinderella team. This year's Carolina, basically.
Like go to the Final Four or something.
Something like that. Something beyond simply winning a round, like going a couple. And I'm seeing a lot of people start to jump on this bandwagon. I'm wondering how bold that actually is. Like, for all we talk about Carolina being good offense, I mean, the Rangers exploded there this year. Panarin totally changed that team. Mika Zibanejad has exploded, and I think he's there to stay. I think he's a star scorer now, and that's just how it's going to be. You wonder, what kind of an impact can someone like Capo Caco have? A second overall draft pick last year, didn't have the best season, but again, he got some legs under him. He's not a small guy. With some coaching preparation, can he come back and be a little bit more improved? You had an off season basically, so more or less, it's almost kind of like year 2 for him at this point, right? So you could be surprised by some of that, and a lot of offense on the back end too. Adam Fox and Tony DeAngelo. I mean, they can generate a lot there. I think they're just going to be a matchup nightmare potentially for Carolina, who could potentially neutralize them with a really good blue line again. That's going to be the ultimate chess match here. Is how does the Rangers offense really go at the Carolina blue line? What is where is the needle turn there? Like, what's the better option? I have a feeling it's the Rangers. I just have a good feeling that they don't have any pressure, right? Like, they're here. They had no chance to be in the playoffs before. It's all gravy for them, and everything just seems to be falling into place. Like, they got out of this rebuild very, very quickly, and it doesn't look like they're going to be falling back anytime soon. I think they're going to take a big jump up next season, and they might be ready to put a dent in that this year. So I think I'm going to be picking New York in this series, but not only that, without really knowing who they would play next in round 1, it's hard to really say, but they just seem to have everything coming together. And if Shesterkin really is what he looked like, I mean, again, that's the ultimate wild card and could be the key to unlocking a long, surprising Cinderella run.
Well, this is the 6th series we've talked about dating back to last week, and we finally disagree because I'm going with Carolina. I don't want to say I think they're upset proof, and certainly with Reimer and Mrazek, there is some level of uncertainty, but I just feel like they're one of those teams that you know what you're going to get. And I hear what you're saying with the Rangers, and if they had a little bit of a better draw, I would like their chances, but I just think Carolina they're just sturdy now, They're just one of those sturdy teams that I think if it gets the goaltending, it should be fine. So I'm gonna pick Carolina in 4. But I agree with you that, the like I said, I mean, Artemi Panarin obviously look at who he's playing with versus who the other top scorers are playing with on their lines. I mean, it's just amazing how he drove that line, and they are a wild card. And if Shesterkin stands on his head, then it's going to get crazy. But I don't know, something about Carolina just makes me feel comfortable picking them.
Yeah, for me, and this is the same problem I had with Carolina last year, I just find it really hard to trust Peter Mrazek.
Yeah.
And now
fair.
James Reimer. And that's ultimately where I land. That burned me last year. Obviously, they went a few rounds, but to bet on that happening a second time is something I would struggle with. Here I am picking a team that's got a rookie netminder playing for them with just a handful of games, but I actually feel better about Shesterkin being able to hold the fort than I do about Mrazek and Reimer. So, I mean, we'll see.
Maybe we'll see David Ayers again. Who knows?
All right, Roy. Bubble?
Yeah. The playoffs are back, and included with that, of course, is good old fantasy talk. Time for some Ram fantasy pool talk. For people who don't know, let me make sure I get this right here as it's our first week back. You can win all kinds of awesome prizes. Go to sportsnet.ca/Ram, $50K in cash, a new truck, and best of all, you can pick a new roster after the preliminary round, before round 1, before the preliminary round, obviously, before round 2, and even up to before the conference final. So if you get down early, don't sweat it. Like any good team, you've always got a chance to claw your way back in. If I was to ask you one guy who you might circle as someone who could tip the balance for somebody in a fantasy pool, who would you have in mind?
Well, with this Sportsnet pool in mind, and it goes for any pool, but talking about ours specifically, you have a cap of 30 stars, and each player has assigned 1 to 4, and the better players are higher, obviously. So you're needing to find those value guys that are just 1 or 2 stars that you think are going to come through. And so for me, that guy is Kyler Yamamoto. He's a 2-star player on the Sportsnet pool. On an outside pool, you're not going to have to spend a high pick on him. You're going to be going, McDavid and Draisaitl and maybe Nugent Hopkins on the Oilers before you would think about going with Yamamoto. But I mean, he was cooking before the pause. He was a point-a-game player. He's got a really nice seed on that second line with Nugent Hopkins and Draisaitl. And he's just still flying under the radar a little bit. Scored a goal in the exhibition game on Tuesday night. I think that he's just going to pick up from where he left off. And again, he's just surrounded and supported by excellent players. He's going to be a value pick. So I think he's going to be a big difference maker for some teams. Who you got?
You know what I'm doing? I'm defaulting to some very basic logic. Pick a guy who's playing with Sidney Crosby. Connor Sheary repatriated from Buffalo at the trade deadline, scored in the exhibition game, and skating on that line with Crosby and Jake Gensel. Again, could be a value pick. And as discussed earlier here, it could be a team that goes pretty deep if you're in that kind of pool where you're just picking them and letting it ride. So yeah, I wonder if Sheary in his second round with the Penguins can recapture some of the good times he's had there before.
That reminded me that he got traded back there when he
the trade deadline 6 months ago. Okay, you won't have to wait long at all to hear us talk about the other 2 Eastern Conference series. That is the Toronto Maple Leafs, Columbus Blue Jackets, and the Florida Panthers and New York Islanders. We will break down both of those series coming up on the other side of the break on Tape to Tape. Hey, welcome back to Tape to Tape. All right, Rory, time to talk about those South Florida Cats. Disappointing year for the Florida Panthers. Thought they'd be in the real playoffs, and they certainly were not. They had a chance, but it wasn't trending that way for the Panthers when play halted in March. They will face off against a New York Islanders team that, this was year 2 without Tavares, and, they shocked people by making it last year. And as I mentioned, sweeping the Pittsburgh Penguins in round 1. They had their nose in it again and were a good bet to find a way to squeeze in. I mean, this is a story of opposites. That's the theme of the back half of this podcast, is we have a Florida team that gives up a ton of goals, but does have good offensive potential, very much like the Toronto Maple Leafs. And then on the flip side of the coin, you have a pretty stingy Islanders team, certainly in terms of high danger chances. I mean, you're playing Barry Trotz's squad. They don't give you much. Similar to the Columbus team that is probably going to be very tight against the Leafs. But, of course, neither the Islanders nor Blue Jackets fill the net. So with respect to the Panthers and Islanders, how do you see this shaking out with these teams who kind of go at things 2 different ways?
Yeah, I wrote the preview for this on sportsnet.ca, and I got to say, this is a tough one to kind of project because the Islanders won on their team defense and structure last year, but they're not quite the same. They're not as strong.
They actually give up a lot of shots. Now, not from super dangerous areas, but they do give up a lot of shots.
Yeah, and, that's part of the plan. Keep the shots to the outside, and they're less of a hassle. And their goaltender numbers are good, so it reflects that. But they're not exactly the same as last year. They're not coming in on the same high. In their last, I think it's 20 games or so before the break, they were below 500. But their defense was trending better. They were, from January 1st on, one of 11 teams that averaged allowing less than 30 shots a game. It's just you don't know what to make of that stuff for any of these. They're just picking up fresh here. Florida, their strength is, and their only strength really, being able to score goals. So it's just a matter of, can they find those high danger chances? Can they put enough pressure on this New York Islanders defense? And I keep coming back to, bet against a Barry Trotz coach team at your own peril, especially when he's had this much time to prepare for one opponent. But then at the other side, you got Joe Quenneville, who's also an excellent coach. So maybe there's, maybe that's not such an advantage for either team. My major concern for the Panthers is their team defense. I have some optimism that Sergei Bobrovsky can find some level of not Vezina form, but something that got him a $10 million contract.
He did it last year, and part of what got it for him was after a very flat regular season with Columbus, he was very good in the playoffs.
Yeah, and so it wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world if Sergei Bobrovsky came in and was awesome again, right? Like, that's why they gave him the money, and that's kind of who he is. Didn't look all that spectacular in the exhibition game. Florida just lost 5-0 to the Tampa Bay Lightning, who certainly are no New York Islanders, but they didn't have Stamkos or Hedman in that game either. But I thought Bobrovsky wasn't 100% in that game, but more alarming was the team defense. I mean, they were just melting in front of him. A lot of high quality chances. Most of the goals were coming like right on top of the crease for the Lightning in that game. And that's Florida's biggest problem is the blue line is not really up to snuff. But that doesn't automatically give the Islanders some massive advantage because they can't score. Yeah. When these two teams played against each other in 2016, it was a really good series, 6 games. Game 6 was won in overtime by the Islanders. But New York had John Tavares in that series, and he is really single-handedly who pulled the Islanders through that series. He scored that overtime goal, put up a pile of points. And I just wonder, do the Islanders have that kind of player this time? Because I think they're going to need it to get past the Panthers. And sure, maybe it's Matt Barzal. He's not going to score a lot of goals, but he's going to create a lot of chances for his line mates. Maybe it's a Brock Nelson. Maybe it's an Anders Lee or a Jordan Eberle. They have guys who can do it, but I don't think any of them are like obviously going to come through for them. They're a little up and down. They can be. So I think the key for New York is finding those 1 or 2 players who are going to be able to lift this offense to a level they haven't really achieved yet this year against a terrible Florida defense. On the other side, I don't know if Florida has that defenseman capable or 2 defensemen capable of lifting the defense. They have the same personnel. They have the same problems. I think it's going to be the same Florida defense we've seen all year, whereas the New York Islanders offense could hypothetically find 3 or 4 games of being better because they do have players you could point to and say, there's a path for this guy to have a good series.
Well, one of those guys would be Barzal. You mentioned him. This is an interesting time for him. Year 2 in the league. I mean, we're talking about him, who knows because the landscape has changed so much, but he's going to be signing some kind of new contract soon. This is a real test for a young player who is really dazzled, but the stakes are really high now. And this is a real chance for him to prove himself.
Yeah, and this is something I think interesting to watch across all series. And when you're picking your playoff pool, by the way, keep this in mind. Guys who are playing for money motivation as well. Yeah. Like everybody's playing for the Stanley Cup and everybody wants to win that, and that brings out a lot of motivation. But if you've got a contract to sign, especially in the cap world that we now live where it's going to stay flat, there's a little extra motivation to try and cap what you can earn. And Barzal is going to be an RFA this offseason. So, there's limited leverage that he's got there. But if he comes through and has a great playoff for the Islanders, that's just going to bolster the fact that he should be getting a huge payday from that team, which is going to be interesting in itself because the Islanders have already spent a lot of their money on some of their older players, and they're going to be pinched a little bit after having to pay Barzal. But again, like he's got that extra motivation, which is why he's the guy I would point to and say, if I'm going to pick one of them to have a really good series, it's him because he's got that extra factor behind him to earn a next contract still.
Yeah. Coming off his 3rd season, of course. Are your head and heart aligned on this, or are you at war with yourself? What's your sense for who to pick here?
I picked Florida. I don't feel great about it. I wouldn't advise non-Panthers fans to pick them in your pool. It's just defense wins in the playoffs more often than not, right? And the goaltending in New York has been fine. It's been good enough. Mm-hmm. And I discounted the New York Islanders last year against the Penguins, as I think a lot of people did, because the Penguins just had the more skill. They had the higher offensive upside. And so it's similar-ish kind of this year. And again, the Islanders aren't where they were last year, but I just think when it gets this close, I usually would go towards the defensive team, which is why I don't feel great about my pick. But I just come back to the fact that, man, I think, and maybe this is foolish of me, but I think Bobrovsky has something in him. Like, he has just been terrible this year. And I can't imagine he's going to go wire to wire like that. I have to believe he's going to find some level of goaltending that is going to be good enough that Florida can win a game 4-3 or 5-4, which isn't even a great game for him, but it's going to be good enough. Like, he's gotta be able to win that kind of game.
One save better, yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think that's the key advantage that Florida has. It's just a matter of if he comes through for them enough or not.
Well, I think in any playoff, you have to apply the logic once in a while of who the hell knows what's going to happen, and certainly more in this one than ever. So that's why I picked Florida in 3. I was just like, all right, this is gonna be the series we were just like, boom, what happened? Head spinning. Florida just came out and won it. I mean, like you said, obviously Bobrovsky is a bit of an X factor. I mean, Huberdeau and Barkov are just such monsters out there. You could see them taking over a handful of games. So I will pick the Panthers in 3, but per your advice, I will not feel good about it.
Yeah, it never feels good picking them around now.
All right. Last Eastern Conference series of the preliminary round, the one that will draw the most attention as it involves the Toronto Maple Leafs, the team that has not been able to win a round in the past 3 years, 0-3 in the Austin Matthews era, losing to Washington and, of course, the Boston Bruins at a couple Game 7s. Little bit better draw, maybe a lot better draw than they've had in those years in the Columbus Blue Jackets, a very feisty team written off for dead before the season by a lot of people based on departures of Bobrovsky and Artemi Panarin and Matt Duchene. But you knew they were going to bring a little something, especially under John Tortorella. Great defense. Seth Jones was out with an injury. He's back. Zach Werenski, great offensive season. Like I said when we were talking about the Islanders and in the Panthers, though, it's just a contrast in style in that Columbus really struggles to put up goals. And that's the one thing, the Leafs can pull out of thin air. They have so much talent. Can Toronto bolt it down enough on the back end, or will they even need to? Because how much will the likes of Pierre-Luc Dubois and Alex Wenberg be able to really push them? How do you see this series shaken down?
I think if you're going to compare a series from this year to last year, this one most closely compares to that Islanders-Penguins series, because Columbus is they're better than the sum of their parts.
Yeah.
Tortorella just rallies them. They're hard to play against. You don't get a lot of high-quality chances. I think they were 4th best in terms of high-danger chances against. Toronto's the exact opposite. They're all offense, not a lot of defense. Columbus is a team that in the offensive zone likes to cycle the puck and grind you and wear you down. And Toronto in the defensive end is not good at stopping that kind of stuff. Toronto's a good transition team, but Columbus is a pretty good defensive team in that way too. So this is just going to be really, really interesting to see what play style wins out. I think Toronto has the advantage in net for sure, as long as, again, Anderson is who he should be. But it's so hard to figure out what he's going to be, because traditionally at the start of seasons in October, Frederik Andersen is not very good. He gets off to very slow starts. And if we're coming back after 4.5 months off, are we getting October Andersen, or are we going to get mid-season Andersen? It's really hard to say. In training camp, it was noted that he had some bad games in there, but I thought he looked pretty good in the exhibition game against Montreal. Nothing was out of place or anything like that. And it's not like Columbus is going to put a ton of pressure on him. It's going to be the other way. Columbus is going to have to stop Toronto's defense and win some low-scoring games. And they have questions in net too. Like, they had a couple of their guys come on, but I think they're early enough in their careers, we don't really know what they are. Like,
no
goaltending, you need to find some consistency, right? So yeah, if you do it for a flash, then you can debate on whether or not you buy that. You don't really know that you can count on those guys until they do it for a sustained period. And neither of them have Merzlikins or Korpisalo. So there's a little mystery there. It's just going to be fascinating to see, after 4.5 months, does defense still bring you an advantage in playoff hockey, or is it going to be so loose that the offense is going to thrive. And again, how does ice condition factor in here, or will it at all? Like, does the ice get more bumpy? And I would have to think that plays to Columbus's favor. Or do they figure that out and it's not really as much of an issue as we think it might be? So there's just so many open-ended questions in this series. I can't wait to see how they're going to play it out.
Do you think there's an inherent cap on how far the Leafs can go with their defense core, or do you see it not so much as a defense core issue with them as a whole, overall team not quite as committed to the D, or just not quite as capable and hard on the puck as they should be?
Yeah, I think it's the team defense thing.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen teams win a Stanley Cup with not amazing defenses. Pittsburgh did it one year without Chris Letang. Washington's defense was pretty good when they won it, but it's not like you looked at it and said, oh my God, they're loaded 1-6. St. Louis's was different. They were pretty deep. So you can do it either way. I don't think it's the blue line that puts a cap on Toronto. I don't think Toronto has a cap on where they could go. I mean, they could win the Stanley Cup. They have pieces that would get you there. Anderson is a consistent goalie. They have a lot of different kinds of lines. You can score up front. You can play with some strength. One of the questions is, do they start game one with 18-year-old Nick Robertson on the third line, who has, a high upside offense, but man, he's got a low floor too on the defensive side. So do you want that on your third line for this Maple Leafs team? Or do you want something a little bit more conservative, like a Freddie Gauthier or Pierre Engvall?
Which against Columbus, you would almost think you skew size, right? Given
I would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would go that way, but is that
the Keith Dubas way? Yeah.
Exactly. Like they seem to buck trends a lot and do the opposite of what a lot of us think maybe they should do. And maybe it's, whatever they do in game one, starting Robertson or not, I don't expect that to be something that necessarily sticks for the long term. Like if Robertson plays game one and he doesn't show very well, I think he's out of the lineup in game two, and vice versa. That's going to be something interesting to watch, but that lineup decision isn't going to be what defines this playoff run. You're going to need a big playoff from Austin Matthews, obviously. I think we're seeing a healthy John Tavares for the first time this year. I mean, he's dealt with multiple injuries.
Yeah, right off the hop.
Yeah, and if you get John Tavares back and he's like he looks 100%, that's a player you haven't had all year. That second line with Tavares, Marner, and Mikheyev was together last night for the first time since December 27th, and they looked fantastic. I mean, that's a really, really strong line. That's a first line for so many teams in this league. And then the third line was the line that scored 2 goals for them against the Montreal Canadiens and is a bit of an X factor there for them. So I think they have the depth that's required. I think it is the team defense that is the big question here, because you don't want to have to put too much on Freddie Anderson's shoulders. That's less of a concern against Columbus than it is if you move on and play the bigger teams later on.
Before I ask for your prediction, if Toronto goes out with a whimper here, if it's just an ugly, 3 games and gone, I mean, I don't know what the team could really do anyways, but my question is, and I guess this applies to a few teams, but because things are in such flux this year, is it easy to kind of write off one more time and say, there's not a critical flaw, or there's not an inherent issue here? Or do you think it's pretty hard look in the mirror time if you're 0 for 4 on playoff chances with this nucleus?
Yeah, I think that kind of decision is going to be different for every team. Like Calgary, if they lose, are going to have some tough decisions, and they're a little older, so
sure,
I think they would still be forced into maybe exploring some tough summer choices. Toronto is younger. They've got guys under contract for a long time, and they already went through a coaching change this year too. So I think with all this upheaval, you'd still want to bring the base of this team back for another run next season just to see what it does. You don't need to rush out. Like, oh, you lose 3 games in a row to Columbus, we got to go and trade Nylander or Marner or something crazy like that. Like that would be incredibly shocking. I think it's far more likely you bring the band back, try it one more time. I mean, Robertson is probably going to be a factor on this team next season. You're losing a couple of guys to free agency. I think ideally you try and bone up that blue line a little bit, but it's going to be hard against the cap. I just don't see a 3-game sweep or any kind of loss to Columbus as a sign that you need to substantially change this team. I think it's good enough that you can feel comfortable going forward in. And after next season, you're going to have a choice to make on Freddie Anderson anyway, and that could be franchise defining. He's going to need a new contract, and with a flat cap, I mean, really, what kind of a raise can you give him given all the other contracts that you have? So that could be the decision that ultimately forces Toronto into longer term choices here, but I don't think a loss to Columbus necessarily puts him into that kind of urgency.
All right. Who you got in the Blue Jackets versus Buds?
Well, this is the one that I'm picking a sweep in, and I went Toronto on it. I just think that these first couple of games are going to be intense like playoff hockey, but they're not going to be exactly like playoff hockey. You're coming back a little cold here. You're coming back like it's October, and it's going to be really hard to go from 0 to 100 right away. But I just think Toronto's skill is going to be too much in a 5-game series, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just roll over the Blue Jackets.
All right, we're going out disagreeing. I am going with the teeth gnashing Blue Jackets in 5. I think John Tortorella will find a way to push those buttons. I mean, you mentioned it. They just make you fight for every inch, and that has been the knock on the Leafs. So I do like your logic. You almost talked me into it there that you're right. It's easy to see a couple top, shots from the top of the circle goals being the difference in the first couple games. But between Korpisalo and Merzlikins, I think one of them can come through with some good goaltending. So I'll give the edge to the Jackets. So I had Jackets, Panthers, Penguins, Canes. You had Penguins, Rangers, Panthers, Maple Leafs.
Yeah.
Sound about right?
That's right. Yep.
All right. How confident does it sound right?
How confident can you be picking teams you haven't seen play
in
4.5 months? If this is going to be the hardest playoff, I think that we've ever had to pick, because you just don't know. There's so much that we don't know, right?
Well, I got good news. You're going to get thrown into the fire and see a lot of these teams immediately, because the bonanza starts very soon on Saturday. The first games of the preliminary round. We've got exhibition games through Thursday, but the real postseason, I guess if we can call it that, will start on Saturday, and that will be awesome. Make sure you're checking out sportsnet.ca for all the Cup coverage. Make sure you're following Rory on Twitter at Rory Boylan, myself at Dixon on Sports, and check back next time for more glass rattling hockey action on Tape to Tape.